Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking exactly how the world-renowned masterpieces of Fyodor Dostoevsky were forged in the fires of immense, almost unimaginable personal suffering. We're going to explore how one man lived through every conceivable misery to diagnose the spiritual sickness of his age, and honestly, why his insights are still incredibly relevant to us right now.
So, let's just jump right in with a genuinely chilling scene from December 1849, because it poses a fundamental question about trauma and genius. How exactly does a man who is staring down the literal barrels of a firing squad survive, only to go on and write novels that fundamentally changed psychology and literature forever?
Part 1. Facing the Firing Squad. Picture this. It's a freezing square in St. Petersburg. A 28-year-old Dostoevsky is moments away from execution. His crime? Basically just discussing banned books and the human rights of Russian peasants. He's tied to a post, a white cloth is placed over his head so he can't see the shooters, and he lives through the absolute visceral terror of a countdown to death. 3, 2, 1, only to receive a pardon at the absolute last possible second. But here's the crazy twist. The pardon wasn't some sudden change of heart. No, the entire execution was staged. It was this twisted psychological torture tactic used by the Russian Tsar just to terrify political prisoners into absolute loyalty.
Part 2. A Foundation of Tragedy. Now, to understand how this young writer ended up blindfolded in front of those rifles in the first place, you really have to look at the sheer volume of compounding trauma he experienced before he even reached adulthood. His father was a military surgeon, so he grew up on hospital grounds, literally surrounded by illness and death. At just 9 years old, a close childhood friend was murdered. At 15, he lost his beloved mother to tuberculosis, and then at 18, his cruel, condescending father was murdered by his own desperate peasants. This final shock was so immense it actually triggered a seizure, marking the terrifying onset of a lifelong battle with debilitating epilepsy. All of this profoundly shaped his view of just how fragile humanity really is.
Looking for some kind of escape, he turned to writing. And at first, it worked. He had massive initial success writing about impoverished people in his novel, Poor Folk. But his follow-up book completely flopped. The literary elite practically tripped over themselves to turn their backs on him. So, feeling totally unwanted and aimless, he sought out purpose by joining the radical Petrushevsky circle. And that was a terrible decision. It was the exact move that led the secret police directly to his door and ultimately straight to that frozen execution square.
Part 3. The Philosophy of Suffering. So, getting his life spared by the Tsar, it wasn't an act of mercy. It was a one-way ticket to Siberia. Dragged across frozen wastelands in 10-pound iron shackles, Dostoevsky spent 4 years in the most brutal, degrading conditions imaginable. You have these agonizing extremes, summers of intolerable closeness, rotten floors, and filth an inch thick, and then winters of unendurable cold where prisoners were packed so tightly their chains would actually tangle up if they tried to move. After that came 6 years of forced military exile. He was stripped of all status, entirely isolated, with nothing left but his own mind to observe the darkest corners of human nature.
He comes back 10 years later, a shattered but completely transformed man, and he publishes Notes from the Underground. This is the masterwork that essentially pioneered existentialist literature. It features this bitter, isolated narrator who purposely tries to make everyone around him miserable. Why would anyone do that? Well, to prove a deeply uncomfortable point, that humans actively sabotage our own happiness just to prove we're free.
The really crucial point he's arguing here is against this popular 19th century view that society could just be engineered to guarantee human happiness. Dostoevsky says absolutely not. He claims humans desire freedom way more than comfort. In fact, if you put humanity in a perfect, flawless utopia, we would literally smash it to pieces just so something unexpected could happen. We're always going to invent new ways to suffer because to Dostoevsky, suffering is the very proof of our individual freedom.
Part 4. Murder, Nihilism, and Morality.
This intense understanding of human contradiction laid the absolute groundwork for his legendary novels. Because during the 1860s, Russia was going through massive social upheaval, extreme poverty, and a huge surge in violence. In response to all this hardship, nihilism became highly prevalent. People were abandoning traditional religious beliefs, deciding that life had no inherent meaning or moral guardrails. And Dostoevsky? He viewed this ideological shift away from spiritual foundations as incredibly, deeply dangerous for society.
In his masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, he explores this danger perfectly through the character Raskolnikov. He's an impoverished law student who adopts this cold, utilitarian nihilist mindset. He actually convinces himself he's a higher man, who is literally above the law, and that murdering a greedy pawnbroker to fund his education is morally justified. But the reality? The exact second he commits the crime, his logic completely collapses. He's instantly consumed by extreme paranoia, delirium, and self-disgust. Dostoevsky vividly shows us that the internal psychological destruction of guilt is far, far worse than any physical prison could ever be.
And this directly contrasts with another giant of philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. You've probably heard Nietzsche's famous line that God is dead, right? He urged humanity to rise up, become the Superman, and create our own values. Well, while Nietzsche deeply admired Dostoevsky's psychological genius, Dostoevsky was actively writing characters like Raskolnikov to warn us against this exact idea. To Dostoevsky, when man tries to be God, it only leads to catastrophic emptiness and destruction.
Through this, frankly, staggering run of 4 masterworks, Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov, he systematically dismantled different social theories. He wanted to prove to the radical thinkers of his day that humanity is vastly more complicated, deeply flawed, and wildly irrational than any social engineer would ever like to admit.
Take his novel Demons, for example, where he takes on the political radicalism of his time. He creates characters that act as literal spokesmen for 4 different ideologies: religious nationalism, destructive socialism, the arrogant belief in man becoming a god, and empty romanticism. And what happens? Every single one of them perishes. He demonstrates that without a foundation of profound spiritual understanding, leaning completely into any rigid ideology inevitably leads a society straight into darkness and ruin.
Part 5. Masterpieces of the Soul.
Now, here's the grand irony of it all. While he was diagnosing the spiritual sickness of an entire nation on the page, his own personal life was an absolute mess. First, he trauma-bonded with Maria in Siberia, which was a marriage filled with misery. Then came Polina, a younger woman who eventually ghosted him, but whose cruelty inspired some of his most fascinatingly toxic female characters. Finally, drowning in gambling debts, he hired a 20-year-old stenographer named Anna to help him meet a crushing publishing deadline. But Anna didn't just type. She essentially became his life manager. She took over his ruined finances, managed his seizures, and ultimately became his devoted wife.
Part 6. Finding Peace and Legacy.
Thanks to the immense stability Anna provided, an older, sharper Dostoevsky survived his own chaotic nature. He was finally able to pour his agonizing soul into one last towering book, The Brothers Karamazov. Disguised as a thrilling murder mystery, this final novel uses 3 very different brothers, the impulsive Dmitri, the coldly rational atheist Ivan, and the gentle spiritual Alyosha, to explore our fundamental human contradictions. It just pulls the reader directly into a deeply personal debate about faith, reason, and how we should best live our lives.
And nestled inside this novel is perhaps the greatest chapter in all of literature, the imaginary encounter between the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus. The Inquisitor arrests Jesus, arguing that human free will is a terrible burden. He claims people don't actually want freedom at all. They just want stability, bread, and someone to tell them what to do. Jesus remains completely silent, just listening to this intense attack, and responds only by gently kissing the old man. This captures Dostoevsky's core belief perfectly. Ideologies promise a perfect society by removing our choices, but true human existence requires the painful, beautiful, and absolutely necessary freedom to choose between good and evil for ourselves. When Dostoevsky passed away peacefully in 1881, having finally found some spiritual peace, a staggering 30,000 people flooded the streets of St. Petersburg for his funeral. And it wasn't just the literary elite. It was beggars, priests, students, and nobility, all standing side by side. They came to honor a man who had experienced basically every level of human suffering, and still somehow had the courage to write about hope. Think about it. He lived through the mock executions, the Siberian labor camps, the crushing poverty, and the heartbreak, all so he could warn us about the extreme dangers of trading our freedom for comfortable ideological illusions. He leaves us even today with this final echoing question to consider in our own lives. Would you prefer the comfortable cage of guaranteed happiness or the painful, beautiful burden of true free will? Take a moment to think about that as you navigate your own choices today.